picture this, a quiet morning in Highland Township, Michigan. You know, the kind of place where everybody knows their neighbors.
Yeah.
It's peaceful, sunny birds are singing, kids are playing. The Pyne family is just starting their day.
Sounds idyllic.
It does, right?
Yeah.
But under the surface of this, like, totally normal family, there's this current of tension building, and it's about to erupt and change their lives forever. Later that day, the mother, Ruth Pyne, is found dead,
Oh, my gosh.
brutally murdered in her garage.
No.
Yeah. And the weapon, a baseball bat.
Oh, wow.
And the suspect, her son, Jeffrey.
It's chilling to think about, a seemingly ordinary day turning into a nightmare like that. Like,
Yeah.
the contrast is just so jarring.
It really is. And it's those kinds of stories that I think really get under our skin.
Yeah.
You know, the ones that force us to ask those hard questions about human nature and how well we can ever truly know someone.
Absolutely. It reminds us that darkness can lurk beneath the surface in the most unexpected places.
Welcome to CrimePod Castle's Twisted Crime series. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the Jeffrey Pyne case. It's a case that really gets into family dynamics, mental illness, and of course the search for justice.
Sounds complex.
It is. So let's start by unpacking what we know about the Pyne family.
Right.
On the surface, they seem like any other family in their small Michigan town, but underneath there were some cracks in the foundation.
Ah, I see. What kind of cracks?
Well, for one, Ruth Pyne, the victim, she had bipolar disorder.
Oh.
And as you can imagine, that put a strain on the family relationships, especially with Jeffrey.
Right. It's a common misconception that bipolar disorder equals violence, but it can definitely impact relationships in all sorts of ways.
Absolutely. Mental illness affects everyone differently.
Mm.
So could Ruth's bipolar disorder have been a factor in her death beyond just a difficult relationship with her son?
It's a good question and one we definitely need to consider. While it's important not to stigmatize mental illness, understanding Ruth's struggles with bipolar disorder is crucial to understanding the dynamics within the Pyne family. You know, the unpredictable mood swings, the outbursts, the constant tension. It's a pressure cooker environment.
Definitely.
Yeah, but
And that's where Jeffrey comes into the picture. He was considered the responsible one, almost like a parent to his own parents in some ways. Could that pressure of taking care of everything have played a part in this tragedy?
that's what the prosecution really honed in on during the trial. They painted a picture of Jeffrey as this young man burdened by his mother's illness,
Interesting.
someone who finally snapped under the weight of his responsibilities. But were they right, or was there more to the story?
Well, the defense argued that the prosecution was way off base. They emphasized the lack of direct evidence connecting Jeffrey to the crime. There was no DNA, no fingerprints on the weapon.
So it sounds like the prosecution was trying to fit a narrative, even if all the pieces of the puzzle weren't there.
That's exactly what the defense claimed. They said the prosecution was ignoring other possibilities, focusing only on Jeffrey as a resentful son who finally cracked.
So they were basically connecting dots that might not have even been related.
Right. And the defense also brought up Ruth's history of erratic behavior. They suggested she might have provoked someone, which led to a violent confrontation.
That's an interesting angle. Could there have been someone else out there with a motive that we haven't even considered?
It's a chilling thought, but definitely possible.
Yeah, definitely something to think about.
So we have a complicated family situation. A young man who is seen as both responsible and possibly resentful, and the unsettling chance that there might be an unknown attacker out there. How do we even begin to untangle this web?
Well, it's definitely a tricky one, but let's start by looking at the investigation and what led them to focus on Jeffrey so quickly.
Yeah, so the investigation unfortunately zeroed in on Jeffrey pretty quickly. They kind of got stuck on what they saw as his motive, that, strained relationship with his mother.
Yeah.
Witnesses talked about arguments and tension and how frustrated Jeffrey seemed with his mother's condition and the burden it put on him.
Right, it's like that classic story, troubled family, resentful son, everything just boils over. Exactly. But the question is, how much of that story was backed up by real evidence and how much was just assumptions?
That's a really good point. Because remember that the physical evidence was pretty weak.
Yeah.
The prosecution pointed to those blisters on Jeffrey's hands and said that must have been from swinging the bat. But there was no DNA and no fingerprints connecting him to the murder weapon.
Right. So those blisters could have been from anything.
Exactly. Like working on his car, which was one of his hobbies.
Oh, yeah.
And the defense definitely brought that up.
It feels like they were trying to force a narrative even if the evidence didn't totally line up.
Yeah, like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's why I have to be careful, because what if they missed other possibilities by being so focused on this one idea?
Right. Because in a criminal case, the prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It can't just be a story that sounds good.
Exactly. It has to be solid evidence that shows there's really no other explanation for the crime.
So were those blisters enough to meet that burden of proof?
That's for the jury to decide, I guess.
Right. But it does make you wonder if they were relying more on guesswork than actual facts.
Yeah, I mean, connecting dots that maybe shouldn't have been connected.
And what about the defense's theory? They said that Ruth's unpredictable behavior might have made her a target for someone else,
Oh, right.
like someone who saw her as vulnerable and took advantage of that. How did the prosecution respond to that?
They basically brushed it off, said it was too far-fetched. They wanted to stick with their story about Jeffrey being the one with the motive and the chance to do it.
Well, Highland Township isn't that big.
No.
It's the kind of place where people feel safe, you know? So couldn't someone have gotten into the garage pretty easily without being noticed?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's a scary thought. Kind of turns everything upside down, right? Instead of a son who resented his mom, we have a woman who might have been completely caught off guard and couldn't defend herself.
It really makes you think.
It does. And it also makes you wonder if the investigation really looked at every angle, or if they just got fixated on Jeffrey and missed other clues.
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, the jury never really got a clear answer.
Right.
They had to choose between two very different stories, two versions of the truth.
And in the end, they decided to believe the prosecution that said it. Jeffrey was convicted of second-degree murder.
Wow.
For those of us who aren't lawyers, what does that actually mean?
So basically, first-degree murder means it was planned out, intentional and thought about beforehand.
Okay.
Second degree means the killing was intentional, but it wasn't necessarily planned.
Got it.
Like maybe something happened in the heat of the moment.
Also, the crime of passion.
Yeah, exactly.
So by finding Jeffrey guilty of second-degree murder, they were saying that he killed his mother on purpose, but without planning it out in advance.
Right.
Seems like a subtle difference, but I bet it makes a big difference when it comes to the sentence.
Oh, definitely. The fact that it wasn't premeditated was a factor in Jeffrey getting 20 to 60 years instead of a life sentence, which is what often happens with first-degree murder.
Right. But for Jeffrey and the people who believe in him, it's still a conviction no matter what the degree is.
Of course.
And they keep saying he's innocent and that the prosecution's case was full of holes.
It makes you think about how, even though the legal system is supposed to be about justice, it's not perfect.
Definitely. And those imperfections can have really serious consequences.
Yeah, no doubt.
So what about everyone else? How did people in Highland Township react to the verdict? What was the impact of this case on the community?
You could just feel it in the air, that division.
Yeah.
People whispering in the grocery store, arguing at the diner. Families split down the middle, some believing he was innocent, others convinced he did it.
It's hard to imagine being in the middle of that kind of storm.
It really was. And that uncertainty has never really gone away. The Jeffrey Pyne case isn't just some old news story. It's something people still talk about and argue about even today.
That's the power of a case like this, right? It makes you question everything you thought you knew about justice and family and even truth itself.
Exactly. And that's why true crime is so fascinating. It gets us thinking about these deep questions and trying to make sense of the mysteries around us.
And in Jeffrey's case, that search for answers is still going on. His lawyers have been working hard to appeal his conviction, trying to find new evidence or point out problems with the original trial.
Right. And that's got to be tough because appealing a conviction isn't about just retrying the whole case. It's about finding mistakes that the court made that might have influenced the jury's decision.
So what have they been focusing on?
Well, they've challenged pretty much everything about the prosecution's case. They've questioned the evidence about the blisters on Jeffrey's hands, the way they portrayed his motive, and the fact that they didn't really look into other possible suspects.
So they're basically saying the prosecution focused too much on building a narrative and not enough on the actual facts.
Yeah. Exactly. They're arguing that the prosecution filled in the gaps with their own ideas instead of letting the evidence lead them to the truth.
But so far, those appeals haven't worked. The courts have upheld the conviction. Does that mean it's over, or are there still things Jeffrey's team can do?
Luckily, there are still some options. They can take the case to even higher courts or ask for new hearings if they find new evidence.
And sometimes even years later, things can change, right?
Yeah. Sometimes witnesses change their stories or new technology gives us new information about old evidence.
It's like the case is never really closed.
In a way, it isn't.
So there's still hope for Jeffrey and his family.
Definitely. But besides the legal battles, there's also what people think, public opinion.
Right, because this case has been the subject of documentaries and podcasts and online discussions. People are still trying to figure out if Jeffrey is guilty or innocent and coming up with their own theories.
Yeah, and all that attention can be a good thing and a bad thing. On the one hand, it keeps the case in the public eye and might lead to new clues or witnesses coming forward, but it can also create this media circus where the facts get mixed up with speculation and it becomes more about entertainment than justice.
It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to think critically about these cases and not just accept everything we see or hear at face value.
Absolutely. We can't just jump to conclusions. We have to look at the evidence carefully and be open to different perspectives.
Because as we've seen with Jeffrey Pyne, the truth is rarely black and white.
It's usually a lot more complicated than that. And that's what makes these cases so interesting. They challenge our ideas about justice and truth and make us question what we really know.
And as we wrap up our deep dive into the Jeffrey Pyne case, I think that feeling of uncertainty is what sticks with me the most. It makes you think about your own beliefs, about guilt and innocence, and how sometimes, even with all the evidence in the world, we might never really know for sure what happened.
It's a powerful reminder that the justice system isn't perfect, and that sometimes the truth remains elusive.
If you're as intrigued by this case as we are, we encourage you to do your own research. Read about it online. Maybe listen to other podcasts or watch documentaries and see what you think.
There are so many different perspectives out there.
And if you're interested in hearing more deep dives into complex criminal cases, make sure to follow CrimePod Castle and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got a whole library of episodes waiting for you.
And we're always adding more.
So until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and as always, think critically.